You're listening to the best, the bravest. Interviews with the FDNY's elite. Last show of the year, and we end it with an FDNY interview. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to this episode 348 of the Mike the New Haven podcast, volume 65 of the best, the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. And just wanted to say a quick thank you to everybody that's tuned in this year. And I'll talk about it more at the end of the program. But just briefly, it's been another great year for the show. Ever since the show returned from a mini hiatus, and last year we came back in June of 2023 after I took 6 months off. It's been full steam ahead, and it's been a great run. You know, I thoroughly enjoyed doing this show for two reasons. Well, really three. One, the great work that producer Victor has done behind the scenes, and I'll mention him more towards the end of the program as well. Two, obviously, the great guests that we've been able to get on the program who make the show what it is. And just as important as the guests, as I've said before, are you, the audience. And it's really 2 and 2A, and they're both interchangeable. Without you guys, the show isn't what it is. And I've said that before, and I'll say it again. If you're going to do anything involving any sort of media, you need an audience. And I'm very fortunate that I have a great audience in you guys. You've given a lot to this show, and you're the reason why I keep on doing it. So things will be a little bit different coming up, which I'll talk about at the end of the show. There'll be another hiatus soon, but not for a bad reason, for a good one. You guys could probably guess what that is. But in the meantime, just wanted to say thank you very much. And once again, this has been a banner year for the program, and it was a banner year because of each and every one of you. So we will run a couple ads real quick. I won't keep my guests waiting too long. First things first as well, or I should say first things first to kick us off, is MC Media Editing Services. Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company. And, of course, who could forget? He's been with me for so long now. He's another one that's been through thick and thin with this program since the get. And that is Mr. Bill Ryan. The Mike the New Haven podcast is proudly sponsored and supported by the Ryan Investigative Group. If you need an elite PI, look no further than the Elite Ryan Investigative Group, which is run by retired NYPD detective Bill Ryan, a 20-year veteran of the department who served the majority of his career in the Detective Bureau, most notably in the Arson and Explosion Squad. So if you need a PI to handle anything from fraud, legal services, and anything else that you might require, contact Bill at 347-417-1610. Again, 347-417-1610. Reach him at his website or the email that you see here. Again, if you need a PI, look no further than Bill Ryan and the Ryan Investigative Group, a proud supporter and sponsor of the Mike to New Haven podcast. Quick hello to John Costello, Matt Shirley, Darren DeFries, and Dawn Gonzalez. My next guest is retired FDNY Battalion Chief whose storied career spans over 2 decades of service to both New York City and FEMA, where he played a pivotal role in some of the nation's more significant disasters, which we'll talk about, most notably the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attack. Spent a lot of his career between Brooklyn and Queens, held a variety of different ranks in the lead up to Battalion Chief. And that is someone who I heard on our mutual friend Steve Kerr's podcast a little while ago. I poached Steve's guest. Now he's here for this volume 65 of the best, the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. It's retired FDNY Battalion Chief Phil Parr. Chief, welcome. How are you?
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it.
I appreciate having you. So before we get into anything involving your career, as I ask every guest, where'd you grow up and was there an early inclination towards civil service?
Interesting. So I grew up in East Flatbush, Canarsie in Brooklyn. I didn't really know what I was going to do. The last thing I thought I would ever be was a firefighter. I never thought about it. I had one friend whose father was a firefighter, and at 17 and a half, which is about, I think I passed the minimum age by about 2 weeks, he said, let's take the test. And it was, I guess, one of the 4 weeks of my life I was in phenomenal shape and did well and was hired. So it was just kind of, it was interesting. It's something I never really thought about, but couldn't think of a better career.
Absolutely, as we'll talk about. And for those of you in the audience that have any questions, as you all know by now, submit them. And hello to Garrett Lingen, a former guest of this show, retired out of Rescue 3 of the Bronx. With that being said, and I've talked about this before with guys that came on late 70s, early 80s. You came on 79. The Warriors are generally regarded from 64 to 78, but it's not like the fires went kaput overnight and stopped happening. Still a lot of fire duty during your generation as well. And people tend to think about the Bronx and Brooklyn. Yes, they were burning during the war years, but that's not to say the other boroughs didn't have their fair share of work. So start now in 302 in South Jamaica, Queens. A lot of fire duty, or was it more other types of emergencies?
I would say 302 was an extremely busy house. South Jamaica, it didn't get the notoriety of the Bronx. You had mostly two-story private dwellings. I'm not going to say we did as much as they did in Harlem or Bed-Stuy or those places, but it was a pretty busy area. Again, a specific kind of fire. Doesn't look great on the news. It's not a six-story, building with fire blowing out the six-story window. So you don't have the news there. You certainly don't have the concentration of people. At least I was told at the time, which I thought was interesting. And this is not something to be proud of, but it just shows the amount of fire duty. That area of Queens, South Jamaica, led the nation in fire deaths for many, many years. And again, I never looked at statistics that said that, but that was commonly spoken about in the companies that worked in that area.
And I was going to, in line with that, ask you, and that's an education in and of itself. The guys that are working there for a long time know that. Every probie has somebody or multiple people, if they're lucky, that they can lean on to show them the way. In those early years, 79 to 81, which encompasses the entirety of your tenure at that specific company, who do you look back on all these years later as having really taught you?
I was really, really fortunate. It's interesting. Most of the guys I worked with worked in the Bronx, worked in Brooklyn, worked in Manhattan. A significant number worked, all through some of them worked in the 50s, the 60s. We had a couple of World War II vets. Which is interesting because my father was too young to be in World War II. I can't think of one person that I worked with in that house that was not a mentor to me. I was a young man. I was 21 years old. It was once they see you're willing to do anything, they guarded you like kind of, I had 50 fathers. And sometimes it was a little, when you're a young man, you get a little upset that everybody's telling you what to do, but all of them had my best interests at heart. They were a phenomenal group of guys.
Now, busy house, as you said, but you ended up leaving for Canarsie in 1981. What led to that? What was the reason for that particular transfer?
So it's a great question. It really goes back to what I was talking about before. Everybody was the same age as my father, or almost the same age as my father. I think there were two or three of us that were in our 20s. Some houses, there was a huge turnover in the FDNY in the late 70s. Tests hadn't been given since 73. 77, they started hiring again. I think between 77 and 82, probably 60% of the job changed. And so there were some houses that had 20 young guys. I went to a house that had older firefighters. There were only two or three of us that went there. That house didn't undergo a major change until the 80s. But I remember getting detailed to 275, another great firehouse, and everybody there was young. Everybody was in their 20s. We had a job in the morning. We came back in the afternoon. We played football. We played basketball. And I was like, wow, this is a lot of fun. And there was no slight to those men in 302 and Ladder 155. Phenomenal mentors. They taught me a huge amount. But I wanted to go where the guys were a little younger. And I ended up in the neighborhood I grew up in, interestingly enough, which is 257 170.
Not counting your time as a fire officer, of course, strictly as a firefighter prior to that, that was where you spent the most time. You had the 2 years, of course, in 302, then you had the 6 years here. And like I said, Canarsie, it's not just where you're working, which is high intensity enough and high octane enough with 257 and 170, but you had other truck companies in the surrounding area that were very high performing. You had 103, you had 174, you had 120. So I don't know if you had the distinction of working in both if you went across the floor, but if you did, let's talk about, well, first we'll focus on engine work. What did you love most about engine work, and what was the position you were most commonly on?
So interesting. So I'm going to talk about, so my first 3 years I was in the engine. First I was in 302, then I transferred to 257, and the next year I went across the floor to 170. In my career, I would say there is nothing more satisfying than putting out a fire. That is, and I was really fortunate. Again, older guys, they had been through the war years. My captain in 302, who I did my best to mimic when I was a captain, gave me the nozzle every tour I worked for, with -1, every tour I worked for 2 years. And it was just a phenomenal experience in doing that. It was, we had a lot of work, and again, there's nothing like putting out a fire. Matter of fact, the senior guys hated when I was working because they knew I had the nozzle. They wanted the nozzle. That tells you about somebody that has 20 or 30 years on the job wasn't interested in standing outside. He was interested in being right at the nozzle. But Captain said, "You had your fires. It's his turn," and it was a great experience.
Absolutely, especially in a place like that, and that it lines up with what I wanted to ask you next. Fire volume in a week, let's just say, how many box alarms was it common to get?
That's really, remember, Mike, you're asking me to go back 45 years. When I was in 302, when I was in 302, we went through periods like fire duty is not, generally speaking, it's not, at least when I started, is not, all right, we're going to a fire every night. You might go to 2 or 3 fires in one night, certainly 2, depending on the time of year. And then for 2 or 3 weeks, you might not be doing much. And so I think in both the companies I worked in, particularly in 302, we had a lot of fire duty. 170, we did a lot of running. We had a good amount of fire duty. We did a lot of running, but we went through periods where you go through a lot of lulls, and then then it's 1 or 2, sometimes 1 a tour, 1 every set of tours. But you might go through a lull where for a month you're just going to emergencies. You're always doing something. It's rare, and all of the units I've worked in, you're never just sitting around. 170, believe it or not, had the distinction at one point as being the busiest truck in the 15th Division for runs, not in occupied structural work, which was the metric we used at the time to determine how busy you were. We weren't, there were plenty of trucks that had more occupied structural hours than we did, but we ran a lot, and we had a huge area to cover as well.
Now, when you talk about emergencies, are we talking medicals, MVAs, shooting, stabbings? Those are the type of calls you're talking about?
Yeah, a lot of. So when I was in 302, I guess both companies in their parkways, both happen to be near the Belt Parkway, as a matter of fact. And you go into a lot of MVAs. We've always done medical runs. Interesting, even though when we got EMS, which was much later when we officially got EMS, my whole career I've responded to medical runs. So I'll give you, I don't know if you want, I'll give you what I consider a funny story.
Sure, yeah.
When I was in 257. So before I started, I had one friend that was, and he was a lieutenant in EMS, which was still Health and Hospitals at the time. And he says, "Hey, you're going to be a firefighter. I'm going to put you in the EMS school. So you become an EMT. You'll be a firefighter. You'll know some medical." So I actually was an EMT before I became a firefighter, but I wasn't working as an EMT. I just took the class and got my card. In any case, so I'm on about a couple of weeks. We go to a call where somebody is apparently dead. We start mouth to mouth. I don't remember what it was, but I'm saying, "Hey, listen, I'm the junior guy. I'm a certified EMT. I just got an EMT school." There's a lieutenant who I found out later. Boy, I want to say his name was McCarthy, a legend in the job. And it's been, again, over 40 years since I've seen him. He literally physically pushes me away. He says, "I got it, kid." And he starts doing mouth to mouth on this guy. And so I go and get the airway. And when I put the airway in, the guy was not breathing, but he still had the gag reflex. He projectile vomits up into the lieutenant's mouth. And I'm standing there. I'm 21 years old. Yeah, I see your face. And I'm saying this for a reason. I'm telling this for a reason. And this is what I saw. The lieutenant literally spit it out, wiped it away, and then he did something I don't think I can do. He went back down and started giving the guy mouth to mouth again. Now I'm going back to the years. This is before we used the bag valve. There was no bag valve. You gave mouth to mouth resuscitation. In 1979, when I started in the early 80s, there were no mechanical airway devices or anything like that. And when he went back down on that guy, giving him mouth to mouth, I was like, I don't think I can do that. But you know what? I tell that story because that told me the men that I worked with at that time, and I say men because that's what it was at that time. And obviously women came on later, and they did the job. But the men that I came on with at that time, they did what it took, and it didn't matter what it was. And so, it was funny, but it was a lesson that was to be repeated many times.
Absolutely. Chris Ebden, who was working in New York City EMS back then, he's asking if you're talking about Chris McCarthy.
No, I don't remember. His first name for me was Lou, so I called him Lieutenant. So it was McCarthy. The lieutenant who was giving mouth to mouth was a fire lieutenant, not an EMS lieutenant.
Not an EMS lieutenant.
Lieutenant, and I guess it was confusing. One of my friends was a lieutenant in EMS that got me into the EMS school, to become an EMT.
Gotcha. Hello to Chris Burke in the chat. See you, buddy.
And his name was Sid Cohen. Some folks still remember him, but he was around for a while back in the day.
I mean, listen, that takes guts and fortitude. There's a guy that you could tell he's seen way worse if he's able to just casually brush that off and keep going. Because I don't. I'm with you, Chief. I don't think I could do that.
but again, the lesson wasn't. The lesson was he did what it took. It didn't matter.
Right.
That happened.
Yeah, of course. He kept on going. That's for sure. So I did want to ask about, from this standpoint, fires that stick out. But before I get to that, I did want to talk about truck work with you. We talked about engine work earlier. Truck work anywhere is interesting if you're working in a busy enough city. Truck work in New York City is a league of its own. And especially during that time in Brooklyn, it's really enjoyable. Yes, the engine's valuable, the nozzle's valuable, but the truck has its functions too, especially at boxes where searches are required. So having worked in 170 for the period of time that you did, what did you most enjoy about truck work?
You make your own decisions. You work alone. Very often you work alone, and you kind of gain your own measure by knowing you're not being directly supervised. And that was the most interesting thing about truck work, and probably the thing I enjoyed the most. You had decisions to make. And you did the best that you could. Sometimes you were joined, or at some point you were usually joined by second due truck if you had the roof, if you had the OB. But even if you had the irons or the can, when you're assigned to be with the officer, they may go left and you may go right. And so there was a lot of autonomy working in the truck, and I enjoyed that very much. I also enjoyed. I mean, I was. We all have different gifts. I had, at the time, I had a lot of strength. I loved forcing doors. You physically, working. But I think it's the autonomy that you have in the truck that I enjoyed the most, and the ability to make decisions. So.
We're talking with retired FDNY Battalion Chief Phil Parr. This is volume 65 of the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. From that time period, either from the engine or in the truck, is there a fire that sticks out where afterwards you were saying, man, that was one heck of a job?
I'll give you two. And one, at least one of the stories I think is kind of funny. So I told you my captain, Jack Daly, he gave me the speech. And again, when you first come into the firehouse, he gives you about a 5 or 10 minute speech, what his expectations are, what he expects from you. And again, it's the same speech that when I gave to the probies that came into my firehouse when I was a captain. But one of the things he said, because when I came in, we were just getting to stop 4.5. My company, for the first, literally the 4.5 wasn't 2 weeks old in my house. So needless to say, most of the firefighters that I ran in with did not wear the mask because they spent 30 years going into fires with no mask. And so my captain said, the guys here most of them are not going to wear the mask. You make sure you wear your mask. And he told me all these horror stories about being in the hospital and smoke inhalation and all these different things. So, you're a kid and you want to be like everybody else. You want to be like all these guys. And like I say, we were pretty busy. And after about 6 or 8 months, I had been to a lot of fires, and I remember, I can even tell you where it was. It was on Baisley Boulevard and Rockaway Boulevard. And at the time, it was just an open lot. and there was a guy that sold papers out of a kiosk. It was like an old, think about something about the size of a tractor trailer, the trailer part of a tractor trailer. And back in the day, a lot of your listeners may not realize this, but we used to get newspapers, and we actually used to read the paper, and the Sunday Times was huge. It was, 100 pages, 150 pages.
What are you talking about? I have no idea what you're referring to.
It's amazing that that we actually used to have ink and paper. So imagine a Saturday night where you have the Daily News. All these papers are stacked in front of this kiosk where this guy sold papers, and he had a big cutout that he would stand in and sell papers out of. And this thing is roaring. I mean, and it's a nothing fire. There's so much fire that there's no smoke. I mean, everything was burning. All the papers were burning. The wood was burning. So I'm figuring, you know what? We can hit everything with the line. Now, this is what I'm saying to myself. Through this giant opening in this kind of shack, so to speak. No reason for me to put on my mask because none of these other guys are wearing their mask. And again, as I said, everything was burning. The smoke was burning. Everything was burning. So we must have hit this fire for about 30 seconds. I'm not even sure if it was 30 seconds. And my captain, who also wasn't wearing a mask, said, "Let's move in." And I was like, why? But you don't question it. You just go. And this was, and when I tell you, I crawled a half a body's length into this place, and the superheated air just closes your throat. So you go like that where you're choking. And I was ready to bail out, and he's laying on me, and he grabs me and says, I don't know how he's able to speak. And he says, "Get in there, move in there." And I realized I was going to die in there if I didn't put out that fire, because that was the only way I was getting out of there. And we moved in aggressively and put out the fire. Now I tell that story again. Well, actually the story's not over. So we put out the fire and everything was fine. And I remember the day I had my, you buy dinner when you get off your probation. And I says, "Hey, Cap, you remember that fire we had?" And I described where it was. And this is 6 months later. We've been to plenty of fires since then. I said, why did we ever go into that place? There was no reason to go in there. And he said, "Because I told you to wear your mask. You didn't wear your mask, and I wanted you to see what it was like." And it was a lesson. And of course, at the time, and I'm not recommending this for anyone, at the time you begin to get your measure, you begin to develop. You don't want to develop this. It's a tolerance for carbon monoxide, which slowly kills you. But you're able to take more smoke as you're a firefighter because your body builds up that tolerance. It's poison, so it's not a good thing. I'm not recommending that for any guys. But I was even shocked that he remembered when I walked into that firehouse the first day to wear my mask. The fact that I didn't wear my mask, he made sure he taught me a valuable lesson. So I got a lot of lessons like that. But again, it was all part of the growing experience.
Absolutely.
No, I think the first really hairy fire that I went to. I just transferred into 170, so I had a little bit more than 3 years. And it was in East New York behind Brookdale Hospital. And I remember it actually came in as an ERS no contact box, which is, are you familiar with that? I'm not sure if they still have that.
A no contact box, not a pull box. Like ERS,
no, it
wasn't
a pull box, right? It was an ERS where you just hit the button.
Mm-hmm.
And what people would do sometimes is just hit the button and then keep walking down the street. Usually they would send one engine for that because it was just usually a kid or somebody just hitting the button and then they would walk away. Nobody would speak into the box. And so 283 was, they got an ERS no contact. It was a rainy, misty night. It was a rainy, misty night. Somebody put an ERS box. They transmit the box. When they open up their doors, they transmitted the box. When they transmitted the box, we were first due. 170 was first due. I think 120 was second due to that particular location. As soon as we opened our doors, and we're a good mile and a half, I would say a good mile and a half away, as soon as we opened the doors, we knew we had a job because the rain and the mist and the humidity kept everything down. When we got there, there was so much smoke in the street that I didn't know what side of the street the building was that was on fire was. So the only reason I knew, and like I say, I transferred to 170 with like literally almost the day I got on the job. So this was like November, October 1982. And it was, I was afraid of getting lost. It was a pretty big tenement. I was afraid of getting lost. So, my mask was off and on. You couldn't see where you were in the street, let alone in the fire building. I think it went to a third or fourth alarm. It was the first fire that I had been to where, you had fire in the first, on the first floor in the front. Then there's reports of fire. I had the irons. You had fire on the third floor in the rear. I mean, it was in the chases. It was in the I-beams. It was moving all around the building. It was a very long night. It was a very long night. And so it was, I remember the chauffeur of 120 got lost. And I knew it was the chauffeur of 120 because he had, boy, I'm going back for your listeners a long time.
Oh, we appreciate it.
He had the standard Scott mask, which was, it had a bell system. So 4.5 was new. And I could hear his bell going off, so that the 4.5 had a vibration that went off. And my captain wasn't wearing a mask because we had 6 guys that night. And he gave his mask to the 6th firefighter. He didn't go in with the mask. And again, you can cut the smoke with a knife at this point. And he looks at me and he says, go get him, because the chauffeur from 120 was like, I'm lost. I don't know the way out. And you can hear him. And he looked at me and he said, go get him. And all I can think of in my head is the chauffeur is usually the senior guy in a premier, and 120 is a premier firehouse. He wants me to go get that guy. And my eyes open up. Fortunately, because I had no idea where I was, what the layout of the building was, I took 3 steps and literally ran into him. And so it wasn't, it's not like I was searching through the apartment. Literally 3 steps into the apartment, ran into him. And he was able to get out and change his mask. But that fire, we were probably there for 4 or 5 hours. That was the first fire where it was like, it gave you pause. I mean, it was the first one where, I'd taken beatings at a lot of fires, but I guess it was the smoke that was so, I hadn't experienced anything like that before. And that was the first time. So that was a very memorable fire. I mean, there's a lot of memorable fires, but those are the 2 that I remember for a variety of reasons.
I feel like all of that is definitely preparing you for what would come in 1987, which was the promotion to lieutenant. You go through these fires, you take your beatings, you see how the officer conducts himself, and it rubs off on you. You take those pointers with you as that opportunity came about in 87. Now, I've asked this to guys before, rather it be coming on the PD or coming on the FD, which is some guys come into the job thinking, I'd like to be a boss someday. Some guys don't realize that's an ambition that they have until they're a few years into it. They kind of play it by ear. Did you know early on that that was something you eventually wanted, or was it something that maybe 3 or 4 years in, you thought to yourself, I'll take the test for lieutenant?
That's a great question. And I'll try and go back as much as I can. I think I always knew. So most guys had a second job. I've always said I was too lazy to have a second job. And so I made my second job studying. And going back to 302, there were a few guys there that were really studying. And one of my great mentors, Harold McNeil, was a black firefighter that was, he wasn't playing cards. He wasn't hanging out with the guys. Every day he came into work, he went downstairs, he sat at the ping pong table, and he studied. And he said, there was a test in 81, which I couldn't take, which is, a good thing I only had 2 years. So I took the next test that I could take. He said, I'm not going to make you do it now, but he says, the day after this test, you're going to start studying. And that's exactly what I did. I knew I had a family. I had already had a child. When I got into the job, my daughter was born. She was born about when I had 6 months on the job. And so I knew I needed to study. And I wanted to, and Harold told me, again, one of my mentors, Harold told me, he said, it'll make you better at what you do. He says, even if you fail the test, it'll make you a better firefighter. Study. And so those are words I always took to heart. When I went to 170, I have 3 people. Yeah, well, 4 people, well, 3 people from 170 that I'm really close to, still close to this day. We formed a study group. In that study group, 2 of us are battalion chiefs, 2 of us are deputy chiefs. One was the 15th Division commander later on. As a matter of fact, one of the folks that joined my study group later on when we were studying for lieutenant was Bobby Sweeney, who was the chief of operations. So I was really fortunate to be with some really high-performing folks as far as the books. And we were extremely competitive when we studied, which, you know, I could talk about that. But I think when I got on, I knew I was going to study. I don't know that I wanted to be the boss. For me, the studying was because you study for so long. I think you try and explain it. And am I talking too long? Tell me if I'm.
No,
okay.
This is your story. You tell how you see fit.
Okay, so one of the things that people don't understand, and it's not that it's brain surgery, although some of what you study for to become a lieutenant in the FDNY is pretty deep. But what people don't understand is that the promotional exams in the FDNY are competitive, and so you can score a 90 and not get promoted if everybody else scores a 98. So the people who get promoted, because the competition is fierce, you have to put the time in, because you're not graded on, okay, you got a 70 and you're going to pass. You're graded on how everybody else does on that exam. And one of the things that I loved about the FDNY, I mean, and I don't know that I've run into a job since that's anything like that, even though it's competitive, no matter where you go, or even if you're detailed to another firehouse and there's other folks studying, every man and woman on the job that's studying is helping you. So if you have a question or you don't understand something or you want to know something and you're in a house where maybe you're working overtime or you're detailed to, and you say, hey, yeah, I'm reading this and it's on whatever it is, pump. It doesn't matter what the subject is. Somebody will sit down and tell you everything they know about that and explain it. And so the feeling of camaraderie, that the familial feeling, everybody is there for. I've never seen in the 25 years I spent in the FDNY someone who didn't open up and completely help someone else when they were having an issue or problem, even though that person might be in competition with them.
That's the way to approach it, ultimately, because it is a brotherhood at the end of the day. You help your fellow brother or sister
100%,
out.
100%.
That's exactly what happened. So getting that assignment in 1987, it's a wonderful moment. You're 8 years into your career at this point, so you're a bit more comfortable with yourself as a firefighter. But now comes the hard part, because it's been covered before. The hardest transitions a firefighter who ends up becoming an officer will have is firefighter to lieutenant, captain to chief. This is the first of the 2 that you did in your 25 years on the job, because now it's not just about you. It's about the crew under you. You're thinking about them first before yourself. At the same time, being a newer officer, they're getting to know you, you're getting to know them. And so you bounced around for a little bit on coverage assignments until you finally got to 308 engine. Now, we'll talk about the demographics. Where was 308 engine? What was the call duty like? And tell me about learning how to be an officer there.
So I was a lieutenant for 6 years. I bounced for 4 years. As a matter of fact, and one of the reasons why I knew I was going to bounce for 4 years is because I kind of wanted to, it's exciting. I enjoyed bouncing. I loved it. I loved working in different firehouses. 308 is actually down the road from 302. It's in the 5-2 battalion or 5-1 battalion. All the battalions, the 5-0, the 5-4, and I want to say the 5-1. It might be the 5-2, I forget. The 308's on, it's right off, I want to say Jamaica Avenue and Lefferts Boulevard. May not be as high. I think it's Jamaica and Lefferts. And so it's right outside of South Jamaica, Queens. They do, again, kind of like 302, 303, 126. Those are the companies we ran in with. They do a good amount of work. Again, it's all 2-story private dwellings. But when I got promoted in 87, I felt pretty comfortable as a lieutenant, even though it is a definite change in responsibilities, and it's one I took very seriously. It's one I had prepared for a long time. And I felt confident. I felt confident in my abilities when I got promoted to lieutenant. So that wasn't I'll tell you later what I felt was the biggest step that I took. But I felt pretty comfortable. I felt, and I don't think I was overly confident or anything like that. But bouncing and seeing different places, I really enjoyed that. One of the things I liked about 308 specifically when I went there was a young house. And I was 28, 29, I guess, 29 when I got promoted. So I was relatively young. I had 8 years on the job. I had gone on about as young as you can be when you get on the job. The guys were all young. We were all about the same age. And it was a lot of fun. You talk about truck work. When you pull in first due with a single engine, somebody's got to open the door. So I felt like when I was a lieutenant in a single engine, I still got to be in the truck while the guys are stretching a line. I got to force entry into the apartment or into the house, do a search, fight the fire, look for any individuals, and then by that time, the time I did a preliminary quick dash in there, the guys were usually at the door with the line, and we go in and put out the fire. And so that was maybe the most fun I had while I was on the job, because I felt like I got to do truck work and I still got to do engine work, and I was with a lot of young guys. So that was a lot of fun.
From that snapshot of your career, 87 to 93, the first leg of as a fire officer, and it doesn't have to be a fire. Is there an incident of any sort that sticks out where you came away thinking afterwards, you know what, now I feel like an officer, I think I handled that really well?
You know, everything is a learning experience, and I want to say this. So I'll give you one. So you asked a good question. So I'm going to give you a couple of stories. One of them is when I was a firefighter, because sometimes you learn more from the mistakes that you make.
Yeah.
So I remember I was at a fire, and I was thinking about it when I knew I was going to do this interview. And I remember we had a good job, and this was sometime in the early 80s, and I didn't feel I performed well. I mean, I just didn't feel, and I couldn't tell you what it was. I couldn't tell you anything about the fire. But I just didn't feel like, I just didn't feel I performed well. And I was depressed and I was upset. And I went up to one of the more experienced guys in 170, and I says, Joe, I feel like I screwed up, and, I'm talking to him, and I was really down, and he told me something interesting. And again, a life lesson. He said, Phil, he says, we've been to, plenty of fires together. He says, you're a good fireman. He said, you're not going to be, I think he said something like, some days, what, how did he put it? Some days you're the fire hydrant. You know what I'm saying? I mean, in other words, some days you're just not going to perform. He says, the only difference between now and 10 years ago or 5 years ago is that we would have gone to 2 or 3 more fires. We'll go to 2 or 3 more fires tonight, and you can redeem yourself. He says, you may have to wait a couple of weeks to redeem yourself. And I always remembered that. So I remember it's about the lesson, not so much about, I really perform well. But I think the leadership, when the men and women that work for you, when they respect you. When you, in a sense, particularly as a lieutenant. So if there's anybody listening to this and they're a first level supervisor, I know in New Jersey, in some houses or in other places, first level might be a captain. But when you're a first level supervisor, there will be a period where the firefighters that are working for you may test you, and that's okay, because they want to know who's leading them. And I went through that. There's some kind of funny stories in 308, but when they respect you and they tell you that, hey, when they enjoy working with you, when they have confidence in you, and it's not so much what you can put into words. Well, I'll give you one. I used to like to work on the 4th of July, because the 4th of July, you might go to 5 fires in one night. And,
oh yeah.
And so I remember I did whatever I had to do to work the 4th of July. I was at 308. As a matter of fact, I say they for a reason, 3 jobs that night. First job we had, it was a fire in a kind of like a Collier's mansion. It was a vacant building. And they were stretching the line, and I was doing my thing. I couldn't get into the door because there was just so much junk behind the door. So I tried to crawl through a window, and I didn't put my gloves on. And so as I go crawl through the window, I take the window, a shard of glass goes right through my hand. Right? Yeah, that wasn't a lot of fun, but that kind of put me out of action for that night, and they get a covering officer, good guy, nothing. But they said, and I guess, and this is, remember, I was bouncing for 4 years, so this is my 5th year as a lieutenant, so I wasn't a new lieutenant. But I'm at the firehouse, I had gone to the hospital and my hand is swollen and I got a big bandage around my hand. And like I say, I had to get stitches in my hand, the whole nine. And they catch a job in an attic. And I remember they came back without telling the whole story. Although I guess the funny thing, Jack Fleethouse? He was a firefighter in Rescue 2. He was a lieutenant 126. That was the next truck down. The covering lieutenant that they had, I have no idea who it was. But evidently, Jack Fleethouse bails out of the attic because 308's up on the, and Jack bails out of the attic and he crawls down, and they had to go to towel ladders to get up and put that fire out. One of the firemen said, he says, Phil, if you were the lieutenant, we would have made that attic. And it made me feel good, but I said, if Jack Fleethouse bailed out of that attic, we weren't making the attic. So, but I tell that story only because I really felt proud that those guys had that confidence in me to say that and to think that, and you feel it kind of when you've worked for a little while. It doesn't mean you're Superman, doesn't mean you know everything, but you have the confidence of the folks that work for you. That does feel good.
Absolutely, and you've earned their trust, and they now they not only know you as a fire officer, they know you as a human being, and they'll follow you in. They will follow you anywhere, I should say.
Yeah. And I'll give you one of the tests that I had when I first got there. And I've never been a little person. I've always been a big guy. I've always carried a lot of muscle, but I can lose 20 or 30 pounds at any particular time in my life. So I don't remember what it was. We had a I don't know, car fire or something, and we could have either driven around or climbed over a fence. And I'm like, let's drive around and we'll go do this. And the guy's like, no, let's hop the fence. And they did it because they're looking. I'm a new lieutenant in 308. And they do it because they want to test you to see what your physical capabilities are. And so, I grew up in Brooklyn. Hopping fences is something that I've done my whole life. So I was over the fence in about 3 seconds. And I'm telling the guys, let's go, let's go, let's go. And they were just kind of standing there with their mouth agape. But my point is that if you're a new officer, the firefighters are going to test you. It's because they want to know your mettle, they want to know your caliber. So it's something that you should expect. It's not something you should necessarily fight, but you have to perform because you expect them to perform, and they want to know who that person leading them in is. Captains don't really go through that, but lieutenants definitely do.
I've always made this illustration on the show, which is I liken it to a basketball team. I'm a diehard Knicks fan, right? So the driving force for the Knicks is Jalen Brunson. He's the point guard. And that's ultimately, I liken that to a fire officer as well. The fire officer leads the charge, and that helps, much like a point guard with the center, the power forward, the shooting guard, and the small forward. That's a lieutenant or really any officer.
Yeah.
Everybody knows what they've got to do, but the driving force and the tactical approach to it, well, that begins with the fire officer.
Yeah, and it definitely does. It definitely does.
Talking with retired FDNY Battalion Chief Phil Parr. This is volume 65 of the Best of the Bravest. You make captain in 93. That transition's a little bit easier because now it's more been there, done that. You stick around in Queens. You bounce around a little bit, but you end up once again in an engine, 299 in Fresh Meadows. Call volume the same type of busy house, a little bit different.
No, it's different. So I bounced for about 6 to 10 months in the 12th Division. There's no more 12th Division. That's the area between, and it happened to be, and again, I remember I'm a Brooklyn boy, so I know the area. It's the area from at the time Flatbush Avenue, where Kings Plaza is, on up to approximately the Verrazano Bridge, and as deep as Prospect Park. Now I think they've sliced it up to Staten Island, the 15th and the 11th. Everybody's taking a piece of the 12th. I lived on Eastern Long Island. And you just can't get there from here. I had 3 kids, I think one of whom is listening to your broadcast right now, which I'll talk a little bit more about him a little later. But I had 3 kids, and I literally, I couldn't get home. My family was always very important to me. And so, long story short, I took an assignment in Engine 299 Relatively, no, it's a slow house. It's right off. It's in Fresh Meadows, right off Utopia Parkway. I said, I'll work here for a couple of years. I'll work here for a couple of years, and then I'll go someplace busy again. That's really what I love. And I will tell you, the caliber of firefighters that I worked with, I probably didn't appreciate as a captain. Great guys. I just went to Ladder 152's 100-year reunion. I went there about we just had it about 6 weeks ago, and it was a slower, one of the slower houses in the city. And when I say one of the slower houses, slow is relative. I mean, there's houses that are a lot slower than they are. But boy, what a great bunch of guys. A lot of those guys got promoted. Also, I was relatively young as a captain. I was in my early 30s when I first got there. Those guys were also in their late 20s and early 30s, so we were relatively close in age. I had much more time on the job than they did, but it was really nice to see. When I went to 152's 100-year anniversary, it was really nice to see that several of them were lieutenants, captains, several chiefs. They really had accomplished careers, and you know what? It was nice that some of them had thanked me, and they felt they got promoted because of the example that I set. And I'm certainly not trying to blow my own horn, but it was at the time I didn't appreciate what I had when I went there, because they didn't have the background. They didn't have the guys that had gone through the war years in that house at that time. So you were kind of the captain and the senior man. They didn't really have the senior man that had a lot of experience. And so you kind of had, it's kind of like being, in the military, the officer, the lieutenant or the captain has a role. And right. The sergeant, the first sergeant or, the company first sergeant has a role. I felt like as a captain, I had both of those roles. And that was okay because it were a great bunch of guys. They were always willing to learn. And again, it really was a pleasure to see these guys. Many of them had gotten promoted over the years, and I really value the time that I spent there. Now, probably more than I did then, and I loved it then. It was just I just kept saying to myself, "Oh, I got to go someplace busier. I got to go someplace busier." But those guys were great. Those guys were great, and I'm glad I spent the time there that I did.
And you saying that brings me back to something that the late David Weiss said. David Weiss was a firefighter in Rescue 1, gave his life on 9/11. In an interview in the television show The Bravest, where he's like, a word of praise from our brothers is worth $1 million for a job well done. So those guys telling you, I became a boss because of you. I mean, that's worth whatever promotion you get. That's just as good, if not better, hearing that from them.
And again, I enjoyed being there, but I wish I valued my time there. Instead of, because a good part of it, it's funny, their motto was caught in the web. And that means everybody says, "Oh, I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to leave." But, you get caught in the spider's web, and you don't really go. But we got some work. I mean, they weren't, we got some work. Again, not as busy as companies I had worked in previously. But it was a great bunch of guys, great experiences. And, almost died there a couple of times because we had, almost, caught in the backdraft. At a tire store when I was a captain, and when I say caught, we actually had 2 firefighters caught in the building that had the backdraft. You hear about backdraft, but to experience one is very different than watching it on TV. So we've had some pretty hairy experiences there, but it was a great house and a good bunch of guys, and willing to learn, willing to work.
1999, you get the role of Battalion Chief, and this is the other hard transition because now the playing field doesn't necessarily level, but it sure does widen. And this is not even including the Y2K planning, which we'll get into, but being a Battalion Chief, tell me about that transition and just trying to learn a whole different level of being an officer, because like I did mention just now, it's so much more intricate, it's so much more wider in terms of the array of responsibilities that you have.
So that is the biggest. So like I mentioned before, for me, the role from lieutenant to firefighter, from firefighter to lieutenant, was that seemed to be an easier transition. And lieutenant to captain was almost seamless. Although, and I'll say this for those folks who are going to their second level of supervision, there's subtle differences, but differences nonetheless. Even if you're a covering captain, more is expected of you. More is expected of you from the firefighters that are working for you, and more is expected of you from your chiefs or your bosses, your supervisors. Going from captain to chief was it was a huge step. It was a chasm, because as a firefighter in New York City, a lieutenant and a captain, you think tactically. As a battalion chief, you have to start thinking strategically. So I got promoted at 19. I think I had 19 years. And so think about it. For 19 years, you're thinking tactically. All right. You're used to doing, not directing. I'll give you what I thought was a humorous story. And I was actually not a chief yet. I was ABC, captains do chiefs overtime. So when a chief is out, a captain will be acting battalion chief, and that's ABC. We have a job. It's nothing big. Everybody's staying out in the street, and I'm getting, my ADHD is kicking in, and I'm like, I'm not getting any reports. What are these guys doing? I'm literally like moving, and I notice I'm just kind of moving into the building instead of sitting outside waiting for the report, as a good chief would do. And I go to see what's going on, and the area I was working wasn't particularly busy. Maybe the guys weren't particularly adept at some things. They were having trouble forcing the door. And I just kind of, went in and took the tool. Now, I'm ABC. I'm not supposed to be doing this. And I take the tool and I'm like, you open the door like this, and I start working on the door with the guy. And I think the silence was screaming. I mean, usually there's a lot of noise, and the silence was deafening, is the word I'm looking for. And then I realized everybody standing by the door was looking at me. And I realized this was a huge faux pas. And so I literally gave the tool back to the guy, and I just slunk outside and just stood up there and held on to the rig. And I realized you're not at this, at least at this particular case, you're not a hands-on person. You're supposed to be thinking more strategically. That is something, that was a big, and that was a hard lesson for me. If I had a chief that, if he says, hey, Phil, I want you to, wash down, I want you to, open up the second floor, let me know what you have, for washing down, I would be insulted if he came in to look. When you're a new chief, that's one of the things that you do because you're not because you're questioning the officer that you've given the instruction to, but because you're unsure of yourself. You're used to seeing it for yourself. You're used to doing it. So there's a period of time. Before you're comfortable with relying on other people. And that took me a while to learn. There's a period of time when a line is being stretched, or when you say stretch a line to the second floor. There's that waiting. It feels like it takes forever. Nobody's lollygagging, but you think it's going to be done in seconds. It takes time to actually slow your heart rate down, back up, and let people give you the reports that you need. And that was maybe one of the biggest transitions for me. Going to the rank of battalion chief. It was a great job. I loved it for the year or so I was in the field, but it was that was, I think, the hardest step for me to take, to go from thinking tactically to strategically. And making that transition, by the way, it helped me much later on. Well, actually, not that much later on, going to OEM and becoming a national emergency manager, working for Homeland Security as well. So, making that giant step. But those were kind of lessons that you had to learn.
That was what my next question was going to be, because I mentioned earlier the playing field widened upon becoming a battalion chief. It flips here when you go to OEM, because OEM, you're in the field, but you're not in the field, right. If that makes any sense. And that
100%,
it's a unique agency that combines both resources from the NYPD and resources from the FDNY. But you're primarily working downtown. You're not so much responding to these emergencies anymore, unless it's something significantly large scale. Was that a struggle for you, or were you ready for something different at this point, 20 years into the job?
So I'll give you the story. I intimated to you before we started that I had a little story. So about 8 or 9 months after I was promoted to Battalion Chief, I was surplus one day, and they said, "Oh, you got to go take a medical." Well, I just taken a medical 8 months before this, literally right after I got promoted. I mean, just before I got promoted to chief, I had just taken a medical. I go and take a medical, and they find I have a heart blockage. I have 100% occluded artery.
Wow.
And at this point, I was probably in the best shape I had been in 20 years. I mean, I'm now in my early 40s. Well, I got promoted but I'm just about 40. I was back in the gym. I was running 3 miles a day. I was benching almost 400 pounds at the time. I'm doing the stairs for 45 minutes. I mean, I just, I was really reinvigorated. I was working in the Bronx, really reinvigorated. And effectively, I was told in one day, literally, and it's even hard to say it now, I was not going to be able to work full duty again. As a matter of fact, I had when they picked up the occluded artery. Well, they didn't know it was that at the time. There was a difference in my EKG, and you go through the process where I literally had a what do you call it again? Where they stick the camera in.
A stent?
Well, they didn't put a stent. I didn't need a stent.
A monitor?
No, it's when they go and take a look, they usually put a stent in, but I didn't need the stent. They scoped me. My heart. I'll think of what the word is in a minute. And I had one of my tertiary arteries was 100% occluded, which is a typical firefighter thing. And again, I was in phenomenal shape at the time. I had been in bad shape, but I just that last year I turned myself around, and I went back to the doctor, and the surgeon, who was not we have the heart valve surgeon, who was not a fire department doctor, says, "Yep, you got a blockage." I was like, "Oh, did you put a stent in?" Because I knew that was the end of my career. And he says, "No, you don't need a stent. Your heart's 100% great. You have good collateral blood flow. Blah blah blah. You can do anything you want." Not according to the fire department. But so when I went to the doctor, when I went back to the medical officers, this is over a period of 2 months. I was bouncing as a chief, having a great time. My turnout gear, my bunker gear was still in my car. I had never taken it out of my car in this 2 or 3 month period that I'm going through all these tests and I don't know why I can't think of the exam that they give you, where they stick the scope up your femoral artery and they take a look. I just can't think of what it is.
I'm gonna look it up.
Yeah, because it's really bothering me that it's what they usually do when they put on it when they do a stent, and I've had a few since then. I'll let you do that.
You keep talking while I do that. Don't worry.
So in any case, I went to the medical officer, and he saw the results of this, and he says, "Yeah," he says, I'll think. Anyway, you can look. It's not a so it's
cardiac catheter.
Okay, but I didn't. So yeah, they cath you, but they usually put the stent in when they cath you. Mm-hmm. But I didn't. He didn't put a stent or a balloon in because I was fine except for the blockage. In any case, I went back to the medical office. I said, "The doctor says I'm fine." He says, "You're never going back to full duty." And again, for this 2 or 3 month period, I had all my stuff in the car. He says, "As a matter of fact, I was light duty at the time." He says, "I'm making you LSS," which at the time was the department lingo for permanent light duty. And I said, "You're telling me I can take my gear out of my car?" And this is exactly what I said to the doctor. And he said, this is 25 years ago, and I almost want to cry now. And he said, "You'll never wear it again." And when he said that, a tear rolled down my eye. And he said, "I've seen guys cry." He said, "I've seen guys cry when I tell them that." And I wiped the tear away, and I said, "I wouldn't give you the satisfaction." And I got up and walked out. And so now I have and again, that was 1999. And so you can still see, this is 2024, almost 2025. It's still does something to me because I love the job.
Right.
You know, this job that I never wanted as a kid, but it became who I was as a man. And he's telling me I'll never do it again. So in any case, now I had to figure out what I was going to do. So I went to So I was called into the commissioner's office, and at the time the commissioner was Tom Von Essen, and he said, "Phil, you're going to be the new EEO officer for the fire department." And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm not going to do that job." And he says, "You can't tell me no." And I said, "I'm telling you no, I'm not going to do it." And I won't get into the whole conversation. So we had a battle, and who am I? I'm this newly promoted battalion chief, in the FDNY. Battalion chiefs, while in my opinion they are the workhorses of the FDNY, it's you're just another bottle cap. You know what I'm saying? And so I wanted to do more of my, and by the way, when I say I didn't want to be the EEO officer, I am not degrading or denigrating anyone who is an EEO officer or equal opportunity employment officer. It's an important job, it's a necessary job, and it's one that has to be done. It just wasn't one that I was interested in. And not only was I not interested in that, I was still going through the emotional trauma that I had of not being able to work in operations, not being able to work in the field, not being able to work full duty. And so we were having, he was threatening to there was nothing, if I was full duty, there's nothing he could have done to me. But the fact that I was LSS, limited service, he could actually retire me. And again, without, against my will. And again, without getting into all the political back and forth, I was assigned by the chief of department, Pete Gansey, who I loved. What a leader he was. What a man he was. Excuse me. I apologize. Allergies.
No worries. It's that time of year.
Yeah.
Don't worry. I've been dealing with them too.
Yeah. In any case, he says, "Phil, we have a Y2K committee." At the time, again, this is 25 years ago. A lot of folks don't remember when we went, when we were going into the new century. Nobody knew what was going to happen. The computers are all going to stop working. Nobody's going to have water. The electricity is going to go out. And he says, "I want you to go on this committee. This is the Y2K committee." And what it was each city agency had to come up with a plan in case we lost all power in the fire department. If the firehouses, the electricity went out, if the dispatch system wasn't working, we had to come up with a plan. So there were about 7 or 8 battalion chiefs. John Norman was one of those chiefs. By the way, John Norman was in my probie class as well.
Really?
Yeah.
He's on the show.
So was Jimmy Leonard. Jimmy Leonard and John Norman were my probie class. We had a very successful probie class.
Yeah, I can see that.
Extremely successful probie class. But John Norman, Sal Cassano was the deputy chief that was leading the class. And so effectively, we came up with the plan for what would happen if the fire department kind of went back into the dark ages and we had no more ability to, the dispatch system couldn't reach us. If we were isolated, generators, which actually served to be really the first COOP plan, a continuity of operations plan for the fire department. So each city agency had to do that. Then the city agencies had to go and combine that plan together at OEM. OEM was putting together all those plans to create an integrated city plan. And so I would attend those meetings. We needed one person from our group. I don't know if I volunteered for it or somehow I got to be that person from our group to kind of communicate that plan to OEM along with the other city agencies. And they, I met with Jerry Hauer at the time, who was a legend in the emergency management community.
Another great guy we lost too soon.
Yeah, I owe a lot of thanks to him. And the bottom line is, and I'll say this, the deputy director for planning, and this, by the way, is when OEM was a mayoral agency. It was not a charter agency. So it was still part of the mayor's office. They hadn't had a vote on it yet. The director for planning was a battalion chief that was a covering captain when I was in 302. And he also, among the sea of mentors that I had, was a mentor. I hadn't seen him for 20 years. Bill Nagel and I remembered his name because he taught me some very, very valuable lessons for the 2 weeks that he was covering in 302. He remembered me. I hadn't seen him for 20 years. He remembered me, and I remembered him. Long story short, I was brought into OEM as a deputy director, as one of the directors. I became the director. I call myself the utility deputy director. Anything the other directors didn't want to do, I got. So it was, I couldn't spell emergency management. I didn't know anything about emergency management. The only reason I was made one of the directors is because of my rank in the fire department. So since firefighters, lieutenants, and captains, and the equivalent ranks from the police department were being detailed there, I was the ranking fire department member at the time I was there, being detailed to OEM. And it was, what a giant, that was the second giant leap in knowledge that, that I had to overcome, because you're completely lost. You're like a babe in the woods. So that was a huge learning experience, a huge learning experience.
And I feel like to that point in your career as a lieutenant, as a captain, you're looking at things locally. There's local emergencies in the area that you're responding to and mitigating as an officer needs to. There as a battalion chief, and then now, of course, being an OEM, you're looking at a citywide scope in terms of how to mitigate emergencies. So it makes you think, as you said earlier, more along the lines of strategy as opposed to tactics, and that would segue well into the career that would follow upon your retirement. So besides that, what do you think are the biggest lessons you learned from that little chapter in your career that still guide you now?
So the big thing I learned at OEM was, again, you're talking about someone who knew nothing about emergency management. You hear this peripheral stuff, and not only are you an emergency manager, but I'm emergency management in the toughest city in America, maybe
in the world, arguably,
city in the world. Believe me, I'm with you. The things that we consider everyday occurrences in New York City, and I know this because I worked on the national stage. What we consider everyday occurrences in New York City are monumental challenges in other cities, including larger cities in the United States.
Right.
And so after about 3 or 4 months, I realized that as you're drinking this, your eyes start to open, the curtains start to open, and you start to say, okay, I can do this. Little by little, you'll learn. The biggest lesson I learned from that is just take a deep breath. And you'll get it. So I realized if I can get it here, I can get it anywhere. And that took, don't get me wrong, that didn't happen the first day. It probably happened in the 6th or 8th month when you're dealing with, when you're dealing with something that you never thought you would deal with. But little by little, as you take it a step at a time and you apply the lessons that you've learned in other fields, but you apply them to what you're doing now, that was maybe the biggest lesson. And that's, I think the jump that I made to FEMA was less of a jump because I had that ability to go from literally knowing nothing to being able to work in the most complicated city maybe in the world. Also, the other thing I'll say about being an emergency manager is you're no longer in a command and control place. So, you're a chief, you have a deputy chief that, will give you an assignment, or you will give companies assignments. You're in a coordination role when you're in emergency management, primarily a coordination role. So it's not about ordering or directing. It's about achieving buy-in and moving together and working with. So this whole coordination piece is an important, which is probably more important than that command and control piece. That coordination piece in this world is probably one of the most important things that I've learned that I still try and apply today.
Before we continue with that, and I'll of course get to the events of the 11th momentarily, you have a few family members in the chat. Your son, Paul, commented earlier. He's watching tonight. He says, I'm very proud of you, Dad. Thank you for your years of service and for being a great example for myself and other firefighters to follow. Nash Mono, who is one of your grandchildren, says, hey, that's my grandfather. And Kat Parr says, I'm proud of my brother's accomplishments, and I helped him learn to spell.
She also helped me. She also learned to help me multiply.
Yeah.
So
And your daughter's here too, Natasha. She's watching as well.
wow, I didn't realize this was going to be live, and I sent a message to my son, Paul, who's a captain in the New York City Fire Department. He's
Nice.
bouncing in the Bronx. I'm extremely proud of all of my children and my grandson, um, and um, and my brother and sister. My brother also was a firefighter in 58 engine.
Nice.
And so we went from a family that had nothing to do with the fire department to a family that is steeped in. I think my grandson he just took the last test. So, or is taking the test that's coming up. So he would be the third generation Parr if he gets hired on the fire department.
Well, we'll see what happens there. So
Yeah.
all the best to him. Hopefully it does work out, I should say.
Mike, I'm going to ask, can we, I am an old man. Can we take a quick break for about 1 minute?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'll hold the fort in the meantime while you do that.
Thank you.
All right, no problem. This is volume 65 of the best, the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. For those of you just tuning in, we're talking with our guest tonight is retired Battalion Chief Phil Parr. He served from 1979 to 2004 in the FDNY with a detail to the Office of Emergency Management. Now, for those of you that may not know what that was, and Greg Parr, you're in the chat. Good to see you too. And thank you for all your service, especially in Engine 58. That was something Mayor Giuliani established to really centralize command between the FDNY and the NYPD. There have been some incidents, particularly where, unfortunately, some of the rescue units from both the NYPD, the Emergency Service Unit, some of the rescue squads from the FDNY were button heads. So to stop that from happening, it gave more coordination to delegate which incidents were going to go to the police and be under their purview, and which incidents were going to be under the purview of the fire department. And it combined representatives from both the PD and the FD. They worked together well, and that's still going now. But that was a Mayor Giuliani creation that started up in the spring of 1996, I believe. Jerry Howard led it for a time. Jerry Howard, unfortunately, has since died. He died of illness about a year or so ago. But he was a man for all emergencies. And Chief Parr, of course, was able to work under him. And again, thanks to Chief Parr's family for watching tonight. I hope you're enjoying the program. I hope I'm doing his career justice. He's had a lot of great stories that he shared with me. And we'll hear some more in a moment. We have yet to chronicle his experience, of course, in the morning of 9/11. He'll tell me that when he gets back. But I did want to chronicle everything else that he experienced in those 20 years leading up to that. A hell of a career he had for sure. And we'll profile again momentarily. Once again, hello to all you in the chat. Those of you that have tuned in since the interview began. Chris Ebden, I mentioned you earlier. Patrick Hetzel, good to see you as well, my friend. You're a regular here. And Steve Iarato as well. And Chief Parr is back. We'll bring him back to the stage there, Producer Victor, if we can, please. And Chief, we continue. Now, that brings us into September 11th, 2001. And even with all the emergencies you've been to, even with the planning for terrorist attacks that I'm sure OEM was doing, especially after the events of 1993. And I remember Ray Downey's impetus for really starting up the Special Operations Command wasn't even just what had happened in 1993 with the Trade Center the first time. It was events around the world. Khobar Towers in 1996, Oklahoma City in 1995, the embassy bombings in 1998, and just the year before in 2000, the Cole bombing, which killed 11 U.S. sailors. So that brings us to that morning where even with all the planning, no one could have envisioned an attack of that level. And you were there, unfortunately, during the brunt of it. So your experience, and I'll give the floor to you, Chief, on the morning of 9/11.
Yeah, interesting. So I was actually, I had spent, OEM at the time was at Seven World Trade Center.
Yes.
I had done about 20 months at OEM. You burn out. It's 16-hour days, 5 or 6 days a week. Went back to fire. I was actually in fire prevention. I was staying at my sister's house in between tours. She was in Elmont at the time. This is all germane. I'm going in. I was at the Board of Standards and Appeals, which is interesting. Again, just kind of well, I could talk about that later. Let me not get off topic if it comes up. In any case, I was already heading, because part of my regular job on Tuesday mornings was to testify as an expert at the Board of Standards and Appeals representing the fire department for variances in the city, for construction planning and other variances in the city. It was at Rector Street, which is 3 blocks south of the west of the World Trade Center. At the time, Board of Standards and Appeals was at Rector and West Street. And so I was already heading into the World Trade Center. Long story short, we know we have the bombing I shouldn't say the bombing. We know we have the planes hit the building. I was in a department vehicle. I put on lights and sirens. What happens is each city agency is expected to send a team, depending on the incident, to the Emergency Operations Center. I was the ranking member at OEM for almost 2 years, making fire department member at OEM for almost 2 years. So I was lights and sirens going into 7 World Trade Center, which is where the Operations Center was. As a matter of fact, my daughter, who I didn't know she was going to be on, who's listening, worked for the phone company at the time. And no one knew what was going to happen. I actually called her up and asked her to call the Fire Operations Center, since she worked for the phone company, and said, tell them where I am, because nobody would know where I was. There was no way, I gave her the number for the Fire Operations Center. I asked her to call. Listen, they're, obviously handling a lot, but I just wanted, I know those calls are taped. I just wanted somebody to know where I was going, just so somebody would know where I was. When I arrived, I went in through I was on the Bell Parkway. I went in through I say that, since she's on, so my family knew I was down there. They knew, which caused a lot of stress on them during that day, that I had arrived before the towers collapsed. I parked my car right outside of the battery. I walk up West Street. I pass the command post going into 7. By the time I got to 7, they had already evacuated 7, but OEM, everybody who worked at OEM, now remember, I was just there 2 months before this, so I knew everybody. They were standing in the lobby of 7. We hear this sound in the lobby of 7. It sounded like, to me, another plane hitting the building. And so when you consider the pancake collapse, the air being forced out of the building sounded like a plane, because you have the air being pushed out like a plane that reverses its engine. Long story short, we go into the loading dock. I was in 7 when the South Tower collapsed. Moved everybody out, myself and John Perugia, who was the chief, the 3-star chief of EMS, was there as well. We move everybody out. I actually, at some point, I was joined by firefighters. I didn't learn who they were for about a year, and that was, again, another story, but I was joined by firefighters from 20 truck that had come in. And I didn't know who they were, because they were wearing old turnout gear. Now, I was in my Class A's. Of course, my jacket wasn't on, but I was in my Class A uniform, my shirt, my pants. I had taken off my tie because I was testifying at the Board of Standards and Appeals. But we actually went into the North Tower after they evacuated the North Tower, and found out that the North Tower, again, I'm not getting into all the stories. There were about 10 of us. We probably moved about 50 or 60 people out of the lobby of the North Tower. We were told that none of us had radios. I didn't have a radio. The guys I was with, coming from home, they didn't have radios. The command post had already gone. The firefighters coming down told us, he says, one lieutenant says, hey, Chief, we're ordered out of the North Tower. Or everybody's been ordered out of the building. So we all leave. We kind of make our way through you're kind of running the gauntlet when we're leaving. We're on Vesey Street. So I literally was on Vesey Street when the North Tower dropped. And if you remember, the North Tower, Vesey Street was the bounding street, or the boundary street for the North Tower. And I credit the Verizon building. If you know the area, I don't know if it's still called the Verizon building, but it was the Verizon building at the time. The building actually has colonnades, and the building extends over the sidewalk, so that when you're walking on the sidewalk, the north side of Vesey Street, you're actually under the Verizon building. But it's open air. So we dove into those colonnades, and literally the North Tower collapsed on itself and into Vesey Street. As a matter of fact, some of the building collapsed into the telephone company building at the time. It's interesting. One of the lessons I learned in 302 is 20-something years earlier, was one of the guys says, "Listen, kid," I was kid because everybody was, So all he says, if you ever have to bail out, if you ever have to run, don't turn around. Look where you're going. And those words kind of came back into my psyche because you didn't want to trip on Vesey Street. You'd be dead if you were still on Vesey Street, at least where we were. And so, I ran, and like I say, we dove into the colonnade under the building, and the North Tower basically collapsed all around us. So that was an interesting time. It was a very interesting time.
I thank you for sharing that story. I know it's not easy to revisit, but I'm glad that you did for our audience to hear that. And I appreciate you doing that. With that in mind, this was devastating for the fire department for reasons well documented. You can never replace any of those members that were lost that day. OEM, on a secondary level to the lives lost their quarters because later that day, 7 World Trade Center collapsed at about 5:30 due to the heavy damage it suffered with the 2 collapses of the trade towers. And these were friends, so many friends that you had that responded that day, performed heroically, but paid a devastating price for their heroism. But nevertheless, the mission of the fire department has to continue. The mission of OEM, has to continue. So tell me about soldiering on and just trying to keep your head in the game when there's so much sorrow and so much uncertainty too.
So I lost 63 personal friends at the World Trade.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, Chief.
You don't think about it much, and you think you're over it. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, or I should say, 63 people that I worked with and that I knew to one extent or another. One of the things, and I hope I can say this without giving in. When the North Tower collapsed, the ranking chief where I was, which was I was on the northwest side of the building. Everybody has their own stories depending on where they were. Northwest side of the building, Al Torrey, and this plays into the question that you asked. Al Torrey was a 2-star chief of safety at the time. And I almost asked the dumbest question because again, to deal with something like that, you have to compartmentalize. You cannot, at least at my, even being a battalion chief, you have to compartmentalize. You can't, I couldn't try and swallow the whole thing because it would be just so overwhelming. And so you calm yourself down because you have a job. And I almost asked the dumbest question of my life. I said to Al Torrey, I said, Al, I almost asked, do you think we lost anybody? And I changed it to, how many guys do you think we lost? Wow. I didn't know we were going to be going here. But anyway, he said, I don't know, Phil, we probably lost 500 guys. That night, I was one of the, at headquarters, I was one of there were 3 or 4 of us who were calling up, happened to be battalion chiefs, but calling up every company that responded. Our missing hit just about 497 or something like that. And Al's words stuck in my head. That's when it really hit me that night. But I say that because somebody's got to get them. Somebody's still got to do their job. And you just put one foot in front of the other, and you keep going, and you keep walking, and you keep doing what you're doing. And so any case, so you ask that question, I think every person, every firefighter, every emergency worker that responded there realized, you can lay down in fetal position and not do anything, but you can't. You just have to do it. And so you just put it behind you and you just do it.
Well said, Chief, and thank you. I know, again, it's not easy to relive, but for the younger generation like myself that we don't really remember that day too well, I was only 1 year old when it happened. It's important that we hear these stories from those that were there. not just that day, but in the aftermath. And it paints a picture of what you guys went through. And thank you for what you did and your comrades did that day, because even though there was devastating losses, it's worth noting, as Chief Pfeiffer has talked about and several others on the police and fire side, thanks to what the FDNY did, EMS did, the NYPD, the Port Authority Police did, and so many others too, 25,000 people survived that day. This is the most successful rescue operation, not just of this century, but ever. And that's in no small part because of what you guys did that day.
Yeah, and also the Port Authority civilians also stayed at their posts. People kind of forget those because they were not uniform. There's a lot of people that went above and beyond, as you know, and you did an awful lot of people that went above and beyond that day and the time after that. Even though it was a devastating blow to the city, devastating blow to the uniform forces and to the loss of life, I've never seen the city so together. I mean, the city really coalesced as one, and that was you'd never want to see anything like that happen again, but I would love to see the city coalesce like it did back then during 9/11. I mean, we were just, it was one team, one fight. Everything was put behind everyone. Everybody was on the same page. If there is any silver lining, for me, that was one of the biggest silver linings.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And those stories of what those gentlemen and ladies did that day will not be forgotten anytime soon. They'll be told until the end of time, as they should be. You had other assignments in the lead up to retiring in 2004. You had recruitment, of which that was, and I'll ask you about that in a second. But just as far as wanting to continue with the FDNY after something like that, a lot of guys left in 2002 from both the police department and the fire department that had enough time. And because of that day, did you mull it, or is it something that you said to yourself, you know what, this is the furthest thought from my mind right now?
It's interesting because I had a conversation that day after the towers collapsed while I was working with someone. I couldn't tell you who it was, but he said, when this is all over, I'm putting in my papers and retiring. And I didn't retire then for a practical reason, but I thought long and hard. And I remember that day, when I say long and hard, I thought about it for about a minute, and I said, I'm not going to let them chase me out. I stuck with my original plan. I wanted to retire because I wasn't full duty anymore. Right. So I was going to wait till I had 5 years in rank to retire, or 4 years in rank to retire. And I went with and that's the plan I went with. I wasn't getting out. So that was my impetus to retire, not the World Trade Center. And I remember saying, no, I'm not going to change. They're not going to chase me out. I'm staying until I get my 5 years. But again, or 4 years, you got a little bit more of 5 years. But my point is that I thought about it, made that decision then. Still, not working in the firehouse was something that I never got over. And that kind of gave me an end date, but that is what I was sorry to leave. Was working in the firehouse, working in operations. But I will tell you, if I didn't go light duty, if I wasn't put on LSS, I would not have had the experiences in life that I've had. And right. So it caused me to widen out. You mentioned recruitment. I don't know if you want me to move to recruitment.
Well, my question to you, recruitment, and this is where it gets interesting for me, is after 9/11, you saw a real call to action in terms of civil service, where a lot of people did sign up or have an inclination at least to want to do police work or want to do the fire service work. But there's also the component of fear too, where a lot of people were hesitant to let their sons, daughters, husbands, wives sign up for the FDNY, seeing the fact that on the front line for any major emergency is the fire department and the losses they just had. So when it came to recruitment efforts and you spearheading those, was it a mixture? Was it primarily those who really wanted to serve and applications were coming in left and right? Was it the latter, what I just mentioned, or a mixture of both?
Great question. Most the people who became firefighters and police officers who took that call, you couldn't have stopped them. My son, Paul, was one of those. He saw what I was going through at the time, and I think he was 17 or 18 at the time. And he says, I'm going to be a fireman. Now, he's always wanted to be a fireman, but I figured this would I was hoping this would knock that right out of his brain. And I said, "You still want to be a fireman? Are you crazy?" And he said, "More than ever." Mm. And that was, I think, and so, what am I gonna do? The men and women that took the firefighter test, that I was the chief of, that I was one of the driving forces to get them to do that, and it was really more about openness, inviting all in. Bottom line is, they wanted to do it more than ever. I've never seen so much people. You couldn't stop some people from taking the test, from becoming firefighters, and those folks really, really wanted to. Public service was. I don't know that the city will ever again see kind of the number of folks who were as excited about being public servants as you did after 9/11. So you have great men and women that came on at that time that wanted to do the job because of what they saw, which is amazing. It's a testimony.
Mm-hmm. And some of them are still doing it to this day, and we appreciate them.
Yeah, absolutely.
What they're doing. I'm seeing a friend of mine in the chat. He's tuning in via Facebook. Billy Dennis is watching tonight. Worked many a tour with Phil, he says. Top shelf guy.
Oh, wow. Billy Dennis. He was a fire marshal. He worked in, Billy was in 126 or 126, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. Billy, it's I don't see you, but so happy you're doing well. We have mutual friends.
Stand-up comic too.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Funny guy.
I miss Billy. Great guy.
Good man, Billy. Thanks, Billy, for watching that. I appreciate you, my friend. Of course, you mentioned retiring in 2004 because of what we discussed earlier from the FDNY. And I'll ask you, when you look back on those 25 years, if you had to define it in a sentence or two, how would you, Chief?
It's the greatest job I ever had. Even though I never hated going into work one day, I'm glad I worked on the bad days, because I would have felt bad if I didn't. The men and women, you may or may not get along with some of them, but even the ones you may not like that much, their commitment to service, and generally speaking, the people of the city of New York, was they were willing to make the ultimate sacrifice and go the extra yard. So it doesn't really matter if you get along with them. You're working with professionals that, and let me please, I got along with 98% of the people I work with, great guys and gals. I mean, I'm friends with for life with many of them. I would do it again in a second. The only thing is I wouldn't have gone to that medical. I wouldn't have taken that medical. I'm sorry?
Thank goodness you did, though. They found that blockage.
Well, now so believe it. I mean, on a personal note, there's nothing that they did for it, because I was in great shape. I had good collateral flow. There was nothing that they did. There's nothing we should do, can do, or will do. You're in great shape. You're in good health. So, it was. I would have stayed home from work that day. How's that? If I had to do all over again.
We'll touch very briefly before we get to the rapid fire segment on just your time in FEMA. Dennis, the late great Dennis Smith, authored a report from Entry Company 82. I was fortunate to know him and have him on this program. He said something so cool a little while ago, not on this show, but on another one, where he was like, "I'm FDNY trained, quote, I'm FDNY trained, I can do anything," end quote. And I imagine that must have been your philosophy for FEMA, even without the tragedy of 9/11, so many other large-scale emergencies. 25 years in the front line, so many of it as an officer. I'm not saying FEMA didn't have its challenges. I'm sure it did. But I'm sure, especially with the assignment to OEM, it was a lot easier a transition into something like that.
It absolutely was. Again, I said, if you work in New York City, you can work anywhere. Yeah. And I'm not trying to put anybody else down. I'm not trying to put any other city down. I have met great people from towns where there's 6 firefighters working to New York City where there's 11,000 firefighters working. But what we run into, working at FEMA, even though I knew nothing about the agency, you're now on a national stage as a national emergency manager rather than as an emergency manager in New York City. I knew I'd learn it. I knew I'd get it, and I knew that I wasn't going to. I knew I wasn't. I knew. Listen, I don't know it now, but I'll know it tomorrow, and I had that confidence, and I really appreciated. I really appreciated that confidence. I'll tell you. I know that I told you I talked too long.
Yeah, that's fine. We're having a great time tonight. This is awesome.
So if FEMA, I started FEMA January of 2004. Mm-hmm. Although interestingly enough, my official retirement date in the fire department is June of 2004. I had that 6-month overlap because I was owed time, terminal leave, and I was owed comp time in the fire department. But bottom line is, long story short, when they flew me in, I don't know why I was chosen, maybe because of where I worked, but they made the decision to fly me into the Superdome along with a small team to get folks out of the Superdome. And it was, believe me, it was not fun, and Katrina was not enjoyable.
Not at all.
But again, the lessons that I learned as a firefighter and fire officer in New York City are lessons that you just kind of put one foot in front of the other, and this is bad, but when you have a giant sandwich, what's the only way to eat a giant sandwich? And that's one bite at a time. And so you have the confidence in knowing that you've done something. The FDNY was you want to. I know that we'll be closing down. I want to say a couple of things.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I lost my train of thought, but one of the things. I may have taken a note. Just give me 1 second. One of the things I wanted to say when I started with the FDNY. Remember the folks. I started in the late '70s. I call it 10 minutes of the '70s. So I spent the last 10 minutes. I spent 10 minutes in the '70s as a firefighter. But the bottom line is, the guys that broke me in would all talk about, "Hey kid, the job is fire. The job is fire." You don't want to, because that's what they were doing in '77. I think they did 100,000 structural fires, and it was probably more than that, which is just unheard of. It's ridiculous how much fire duty they were doing. Anybody who's listening to this broadcast who is in the field, and I work in the field of public safety now, all over the country. I'm part of one of the Homeland Security teaching teams. I work for 2 of the schools of excellence, LSU, which is the anti-terror, the Academy for Counterterrorism, the National Center for Biomedical Research and Training, I think, and then also University of Hawaii does the NCBRT, I forget the letters, but they do natural disasters, and I work for both of them, traveling around the country. Take every opportunity you can, whether you work in a small department, whether you work in a large department, to widen out and to learn as much as possible. The job is never one thing. What's expected from public servants today is 100 times more than what was expected from public servants when I first started. You could say a firefighter, what did firefighters do in the '70s? They went to fires. Now firefighters and other emergency workers, their jobs have expanded exponentially. And so take every opportunity that you possibly can to work with other agencies, to get as much training as you possibly can, to learn as much as you possibly can, and to be as smart as you possibly can. I'll talk more about that if you want to. But I only did it because I was forced to do it when I was light duty. I had to find a way to continue working. But now I recommend that the men and women who are in that business now look for the opportunities now. There's schooling. There was really no scholastic way to become an emergency manager or scholarly way. Now you can get degrees in emergency management. There are so many things that you can do now to make yourself a better responder, whether you're a first, secondary, or tertiary responder. You can make yourself better by working with others and getting the education you need. And listening to shows like this, some of the folks you've had are phenomenal.
Well, thank you very much, Chief. I appreciate you saying that. You know, it's funny. One of the questions I had for you in the rapid fire was a piece of advice you give young firefighters or emergency managers. You just covered it. So
Yeah.
thank you very much. That was very insightful, and I appreciate that. Chief Norman's actually in the chat. That's why I was smiling earlier. He says, Mike, please give Phil my best. We were in Proby school. We were Proby school buddies, I should say, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Yeah, I mentioned John Norman. So John Norman, he was like the dad of our Proby school. I think he was one of the older guys at our Proby school. John Norman, what can you say about John Norman? He's known nationally. Mm-hmm. He's a gentleman. He got us through Proby school. He had a lot of experience before he came into Proby school as a volunteer out in Nassau County. A really interesting story. There were three. We were in the smallest Proby class in the department's history. We had 60 people in our Proby class.
Pretty small for the FDNY.
I'm sorry?
Pretty small for the FDNY.
Yeah, well, it was 60. A lot of reasons, budgetary reasons. So that John, a guy I went to kindergarten with, Joey D'Amico, who was in 280, I want to say, and John Norman, our three sons got on the job the same day, same class, same time. So we were in the smallest Proby school, smallest Proby class in the FDNY, and three of our sons. In fact, there's a picture, I think, in the Daily News of the three of us. So Joey D'Amico and John Norman, phenomenal guys. Like I say, John Norman was kind of our mentor and our daddy in Proby school. So I always appreciated John, always a gentleman.
I know Chief Norman, of course, he's been on this program a couple of years ago. I had the good fortune to chat with him. A family of service. Of course, he was on the job. His brother Dave was an emergency service cop in the NYPD in Truck 1. Yeah. So family, a service definitely runs in the Norman family, that's for sure. Chief, this has been fantastic. And now that brings us into the rapid fire. So many great stories from you tonight. You answered one of the questions, so it's normally 5 questions. Okay. We're going to trim it down to 4 since you covered one of them pretty well.
All right.
And the first one is, anywhere in the city after a long day of firefighting, or even in the firehouse, favorite restaurant to eat out at or favorite meal to have in the firehouse?
I'm going to give you 2. Okay, I'm going to give you 2. I thought about, so I'm going to go back. Obviously not my favorite bar now. There's a place in Bayside, near basically my son lives in Bayside now. And it is called, I'm giving them a free plug because I spent a lot of time there. One place is closed, but it's Bourbon Street on Bell Boulevard. I love going there. Great people. There's a million firefighters and cops in Bayside. It was nice, relaxing, and having a beer or having a meal with them. And favorite meal, I have to say Katz's. When I went down to the medical office, you got to stop at Katz's and have pastrami on the way back. So, Katz's is still, I still dream about it.
I've heard so many things about Katz. I got to get down there next time I'm in the city. I haven't been down in the city in a little bit, but I've heard so much about it. Favorite firefighter movie or TV show?
So I thought about this. My favorite movie, Backdraft, only because it was the first movie about firefighters that I ever remember. That I ever remember. So I think I took my first email address from one of the characters in Axeman. It's when the internet was new. But TV show. Some of my friends don't like that I say this, but what was the Dennis Leary show?
Rescue Me.
Rescue Me.
Yeah, very good show.
I thought that captured the feeling of camaraderie that firefighters had, and the banter and everything else. I mean, a lot of the show, of course, was hype, but I really thought Dennis Leary and that cast. I laughed every time I saw that show. I loved it. I have nothing bad to say about it.
Yeah, it was a very good show, and his connection to the fire service is well documented. Third question, rapid fire, second to last. Funniest or most unforgettable moment in the firehouse?
So I saw this. I don't know that I can talk about that because this is a family show.
We'll say pass on that one then, if you want.
Yeah, let's pass on that one because I want to keep this as a family show. So I don't. I'm sure I can think of something, but since time is out, I'll skip that question.
No problem. And the last one, since you covered the 5th one, the 4th one I'll ask you is most uplifting experience from your career.
Okay, so I'm going to go back, take a giant step back and up. Mm-hmm. When I was in 302, I would say I might know more about the. No, I can't say that. I know almost as much about the 23rd Street fire that happened in 1966, the collapse where I believe it was 11 firefighters died.
Yeah.
Don't worry, I'm gonna on 23rd Street, and I say that because I probably worked with 20 firefighters. Now, again, I was a kid. I was 8 years old in 1966. That were at that fire. As a matter of fact, my lieutenant Walter Clark, at that time, was the only person that lived from 7 Truck. He was the chauffeur of 7 Truck. I think it's 21 engine. I literally worked with Bob Ribby was the last guy out of the basement before it collapsed. And I heard every story from every angle from so many companies about what happened at the 23rd Street fire 100 times. I would say once every 2 months after dinner, depending on what groups were working, they'd clear the table and we had a giant board behind the table and guys would start doing diagrams and you had a different guy that was here. He says, well, I was here. And I heard that story from so many different directions. And I really felt like it was one of the stories that just made me fall in love with the guys and with the job. I say that because after 9/11, and this is the thing that happens with the fire department, it seemed like every firefighter that moved out of the city, that went to Florida or any place else, came back to the city to share in doing something or supporting the FDNY after 9/11. And I would say 8 of those guys from 1979, when I first started on the job, at some point, a few weeks or maybe a month after 9/11, they all came up from Florida to one guy's house who was still there, and we all had dinner together. Now, these guys are retired for 20 years, but they still felt that same camaraderie, that same love. And the thing that sticks with me is that these guys who had told me so much about the fire on 23rd Street in 66 that they were at, now had me diagram and show them my point of view from the World Trade Center. And I don't know, it just seemed to, for me, complete the circle. There were a few things that completed that circle. And I say that because I work now when I teach, and I don't teach as much as I used to, but when I travel, I work with firefighters, police officers, nurses, EMTs from around the country. And we form teaching teams where we do anti-terror stuff. And this is what I was getting at before. You mentioned Al Prats, who might be listening, phenomenal chief in North Hudson, New Jersey. I work with a lot of firefighters and chief officers in New Jersey. We're all in the same family. It doesn't matter if you're from New York City. It doesn't matter if you're from Kansas City. It doesn't matter if you're from Hartford, Connecticut, Stanford. Every man, woman, and woman that does this job is a brother or a sister. Because you may be from a bigger city or it doesn't matter. We all have the same experiences. We all do the same things. And we need to respect that and support each other as much as we possibly can and share those lessons. I know John Norman. I know every time I go out and I deal with guys, John's name comes up, and it comes up because John doesn't say, "Oh, I'm John Norman," and he sticks his chest out and he shows his medals and he says, "I did this." He's there supporting every person that he knows. He supports everyone. And that's what we all need to do. Share your experiences. You have good. I don't know what you've told your audience. I'm really, I really wish you the best in your career that's upcoming. It's a great job. It's a great brotherhood and sisterhood. And don't take it for granted. Value every day you work. Every day you work, and try and learn something every day you work.
Thank you, Chief. Excuse me. I appreciate that. And I appreciate your time this evening. This has been one heck of a show. Stick around. We'll talk off air, so don't say goodbye just yet. I'm going to say goodbye to the audience, but before I do so, the floor is yours if you want any shout-outs, or if you have any shout-outs, I should say, to anyone or anything.
Well, I'll do, obviously, there's 2 groups I mentioned. Obviously, my family, thank you for coming on. I had no idea that you guys would be listening, all of you, from grandson to oldest child, his mother, who, by the way, was an ER nurse in a level 1 trauma center for almost 10 years. So So now she's living the life. She's taking it easy.
Hey,
She's
she
a good
deserves it.
person.
Shout out to all our residents.
No, I'm only joking. So that's great. I'm proud of my son who followed in my footsteps. My grandson's an EMT. Like I say, I believe he took the test or is taking the test for the fire department. My other son's a computer guy. My son's girlfriend and my daughter's new husband. I want to just thank my whole family, and I appreciate everything. I would be remiss if I didn't mention my study group, guys who we studied for lieutenant together. Like I say, two deputy chiefs. I doubt that they're listening. 2 battalion chiefs. So it's Butch Brandeis, Rocco Rinaldi, Danny Butler, and Bobby Sweeney joined us. He was in and out, chief of operations. And there's a group that Al Pratt is part of that I work very closely with, and we do training and exercise. I do training and exercises, and I'm really privileged to work with the Northern New Jersey Metropolitan Urban Search and Rescue Team. Al Pratt is he's on the executive committee now. Rob Seaberger just retired. He was the chairman there, phenomenal guy. Brendan Rhodes is the chair now. Al Pratt. AJ Woods is on the board as deputy chief in Patterson, as well as Lou Moyano. These guys, I still get to have my hand in with these guys, working with firefighters closely. They've accepted me as one of their family. They're basically the rescue squad for Northern New Jersey, most densely populated part of the United States, more densely populated than New York City. Most people don't realize that. There's 11 companies that have that training. They, just like our rescue guys, they volunteer. They get the additional training. They work really hard. I know I'm part of the group that puts together the exercise. We do everything we can do to stymie these guys and to have them run into brick walls. And unfortunately, they're constantly figuring ways around it. And so that's why I just want to say just a phenomenal group of men and women that do that. The core cities are Jersey City and Newark, but the 7 surrounding counties all contribute to those teams, including the Port Authority, by the way. Port Authority Police have one of those, have a firefighter urban search and rescue team, Metropolitan Urban Search and Rescue Team, USA team. So a great bunch of professionals, and I want to thank them for letting me be part of their family.
Thank you very much again for your time this evening. I appreciate it. We'll talk off air. I'd like to thank everyone who tuned in tonight, especially your family. I hope I did your father or brother's career proud tonight with our interview and was able to properly document his history. And I very much hope that you guys enjoyed the show. Again, thanks to everyone who tuned in this year. This was a great year for the program. We got to talk to a lot of really remarkable people on all sides of the coin, from media folks in New York City to primarily first responders, not just in the New York City area, between the NYPD and the FDNY around the country. So, this has been an honor once again to do this program, because you guys make it so much fun to do and you guys make it all worthwhile. And as producer Victor says in the chat, we couldn't do it without each and every one of you guys in the audience. As far as January, the chief made mention of it. We don't know. Lots up in the air right now because, as you've heard me talk about somewhat, I'm getting ready to jump into the first responder world myself. As a first responder myself, I recently received a conditional offer of employment not too long ago from my hometown fire department, New Haven, Connecticut. And things are moving fast, and the academy should be beginning pretty darn soon, and I'll be in it. So when it begins in January, that hasn't been pinned down yet, but we'll be away for quite a while as I go into the academy, go through the training, and come out of it a firefighter, something I've wanted to do since I was 3 years old. And now at almost 25, it looks like that dream is about to finally become a reality. And that's in no small part to the great conversations I've had over the years, including tonight's conversation, that's motivated me to really pursue that career, in addition to the desire that's always been there, but only burns stronger and stronger and stronger with each interview and each person in the fire service I've gotten to know. So thank you, and we'll see you potentially in January, but if we don't, you know where I'll be, and hopefully soon on that truck or on that engine somewhere, getting the chance to do what I've always wanted to. So thank you very much once again, and I love each and every one of you guys. This show would not be what it is without each and every one of you. As far as those of you listening on the audio side, for tonight's outro song, a 90s New York City hip-hop classic. It's from their 1993 album, Enter the Stage, Black Moon with How Many MCs. In the meantime, on behalf of retired FDNY Battalion Chief Phil Parr, I am Mike Colón. We will see you next time. This has been Volume 65 of the Best of the Bravest, interviews with the FDNY's elite. Again, a special shout out to producer Victor. And take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your night.